I've seen it happen right in front of me, a woman standing in the middle of a grocery store aisle, her face flushed, her voice slicing through the air as she shouts at a teenage cashier for disrespecting her. People freeze. A child grips his mother's hand tighter. Someone pulls out their phone. And as she demands to see the manager, her anger filling the space like smoke, something strange happens inside me. A part of me recoils, but another part recognizes something familiar, something uncomfortably human, that deep, panicked fear of not being taken seriously, of not mattering unless someone bends to our feelings. Karen Horney called this basic anxiety, the kind that forms when a child grows up with love that must be earned, approval that can vanish, or emotional unpredictability that trains the nervous system to stay on alert. In childhoods like that, worth becomes performance. Safety becomes compliance. Identity becomes conditional. So when adulthood stops mirroring that old dynamic, when a barista is indifferent, when a stranger sets a boundary, when the world refuses to rearrange itself around our expectations, the reaction isn't about the incident. It's about the old wound beneath it, the fear that we are slipping into invisibility. I've felt softer versions of that wound myself, not through shouting, but through silence. The way my stomach tightens when someone interrupts me, the sting when my feelings are brushed aside, the moments I've wanted to defend myself, not because I was right, but because I was terrified of disappearing in someone else's narrative. Research from the University of Kentucky, 2015, shows that people with vulnerable narcissism, often shaped by conditional childhood environments, react intensely to small triggers because their self-worth feels unstable without external validation. So when I see a Karen losing control in public, I try to ask a different question, not what's wrong with her, but what part of us has felt that same fear but learned to hide it. Because the psychology of a Karen isn't only about her behavior. It's a mirror revealing the wounds we carry, the validation we chase, and the parts of ourselves we're finally brave enough to face. I used to think a Karen was simply someone who grew up entitled, someone handed too much privilege, too much power, too much ease. But the more I paid attention, especially to the moments when I myself felt that familiar tightening in the chest, the more I realized something deeper. Entitlement isn't born from abundance, it's born from insecurity, from the anxious sense that love or worth is never stable unless someone else confirms it. And often, this wiring begins long before adulthood, long before anyone ever yells in a grocery store. Many Karens grew up in environments that looked normal from the outside, clean houses, structured rules, polite greetings. But beneath the surface, love was often conditional. Approval depended on performance. Affection depended on obedience. And being a good girl wasn't about emotional connection. It was about maintaining order, appearance, or parental pride. When a child learns early that their value is tied to how well they behave or impress, they don't grow up rooted. They grow up balancing themselves on a fragile pedestal, terrified of falling. Psychologist Karen Horney described this as basic anxiety, the deep, unshakable fear that the world is unpredictable and that one must stay vigilant to feel safe. Children who feel emotionally unsupported often swing between two extremes, trying desperately to please or trying desperately to control. And if controlling becomes the strategy that protects them, that strategy can calcify into adulthood. It becomes the voice that demands perfection, the instinct that reacts sharply when things slip out of predictability, the fear that erupts when reality deviates from the script they created. I've recognized traces of this in myself too, not in dramatic meltdowns, but in small reactions. The sharp tone when I feel misunderstood, the quiet resentment when my boundaries are ignored, the instinct to correct someone so I don't feel dismissed. These aren't signs of cruelty. They're signs of defense. They're echoes of moments when I once needed stability but got inconsistency instead, when I needed softness but received pressure, when I needed being held but learned to hold myself with rigidity. A study from the University of Michigan in 2018 found that children raised in environments with high control but low emotional warmth tend to develop externally oriented self-worth, meaning their sense of value depends heavily on how others react to them. And as adults, these individuals show heightened emotional reactivity to even mild social stress. In other words, when someone has spent their life depending on external cues to feel secure, the smallest rupture, a wrong tone, a slow response, an unmet expectation can feel like an emotional earthquake. This explains why a Karen can lose control, not because of the situation, but because of what the situation activates. A late order isn't just a late order. It's "I'm not important." A boundary isn't just a boundary. It's "I'm being left out." A disagreement isn't just a disagreement. It's "I don't matter unless I win." The meltdown isn't about coffee or customer service. It's about the collapse of an inner scaffolding that was never built to hold real uncertainty. And that's the part we often miss. The wound that creates a Karen isn't loud when it begins. It's quiet, small, almost invisible, happening in living rooms, classrooms, small moments where a child learns to trade vulnerability for control. Understanding this doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does help us see the human underneath it. And maybe it helps us understand the parts of ourselves that learn similar lessons, even if we express them differently. When you and I watch a Karen meltdown unfold in public, it's easy to focus on the noise, the raised voice cutting across a parking lot, the trembling finger pointed at a worker, the frantic demand for a manager. But beneath the spectacle is something far more revealing. The mask they're wearing, a mask shaped from certainty, superiority, and command. Yet when we look closer, not with judgment, but with curiosity, we see that this mask was never designed to project power. It was designed to hide fear. And, if we're honest, many of us have worn quieter versions of that same mask ourselves. Karens cling to control, not because they feel strong, but because they feel unsafe without it. Their identity rests on the idea that stability comes from dominance, that order comes through enforcement, that being heard requires being louder than everyone else. Losing control doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels like erasure. You and I may not shout in grocery stores, but perhaps we know the subtler versions, the shoulder tension when someone interrupts, the urge to correct a misunderstanding, the knot in the stomach when our feelings go unnoticed. These aren't flaws, they're adaptations. A Karen reacts disproportionately because the moment in front of them isn't the true trigger. A wrong order or delayed appointment is only the spark. The fire beneath it is older. Many Karens grew up in households where predictability meant safety, where love was conditional, where perfection was required, or where chaos forced them to become enforcers in their own home. Control became their childhood survival strategy, and once a strategy protects a child long enough, it solidifies into adulthood. When the world stops responding to that old role, panic takes over. Psychologists call this role-based coping, the survival identity a child adopts to stabilize an unstable environment. Some children become the peacemaker, others become invisible, some become the performer, and some, the Karen type, become the controller. Trauma expert Dr. Bruce Perry reminds us that children adapt not to what is healthy, but to what helps them endure. And once a role works, it becomes instinct, becomes the only way they know how to feel significant. You and I may never scream at a cashier, but we recognize the echoes. Defensiveness, shutting down quickly, the urge to fix or perfect before someone questions our worth. These are softer versions of the same belief. if I don't manage everything, something bad will happen. Suddenly, the Karen archetype becomes less like a monster to mock and more like a mirror showing exaggerated versions of fears we all carry quietly. The tragedy is that the mask works until it doesn't, until someone refuses to comply, until a bystander films, until society shifts. And when the world stops reacting the way their old role requires, their entire internal system collapses. What looks like aggression is often panic. Panic that the identity they built is no longer enough. The Karen archetype isn't just about entitlement. It's about the emotional cost of building a life around control rather than connection. And when control fails, what spills out is the fear that never healed. A fear many of us, in quieter ways, are still learning to understand. There is a moment, if you watch closely, when the mask begins to crack. You can see it in their eyes before you hear it in their voice. A Karen stands in a checkout line or parking lot, insisting on being right, being obeyed, being acknowledged. But then something unexpected happens. Someone doesn't yield. A worker stays calm. A stranger refuses to shrink. A manager doesn't bend the rules. And in that instant, you and I can see the shift. Their voice gets sharper, but their certainty weakens. They aren't escalating because they're powerful, they're escalating because their strategy is failing. Karens don't fear conflict, they fear losing the script. For years, sometimes decades, the world rewarded their attempts at control. People complied, systems protected them. Social norms reinforced the illusion that dominance equaled safety. So when that dominance no longer works, what they feel isn't mere frustration, it's psychological disorientation, the sense that the rules they relied on have suddenly changed. And people who depend heavily on external structure often collapse when that structure stops responding the way it used to. This collapse has a name. Researchers call it ego threat reactivity. A heightened defensiveness when one's identity feels challenged. A 2014 study from the University of Alabama found that individuals with fragile self-worth react to boundaries with sharper aggression, not because they crave domination, but because they're terrified of irrelevance. And when I read that, something clicked. A Karen meltdown isn't about the argument, it's about the fear of becoming invisible in a world that no longer centers them. You and I may not explode publicly, but we know the quieter version of hitting a breaking point. When the strategy we've relied on, being the peacemaker, the responsible one, the strong one, the silent one, suddenly stops working. In those moments, we don't scream, but something inside us trembles. Something old, something scared. Watching a Karen unravel is like watching an amplified version of a truth many of us have lived. The moment life forces us beyond our old patterns. A Karen's collapse looks dramatic because it is their entire identity losing its anchor. If their worth depends on being obeyed, disobedience feels like annihilation. If stability depends on control, losing control feels like danger. If visibility depends on dominance, not being taken seriously feels like erasure. What we see on the outside is just the unraveling happening within. And the saddest part is that when they reach this point, they don't soften, they harden. They double down, they cling to a strategy already slipping away. We can see the fear under the rage, but they can't. What looks like entitlement is often desperation. What looks like anger is often grief. And that's why understanding this collapse matters, not to excuse it, but to recognize a universal truth. All of us break when the very strategies that once protected us become the cages we can no longer live inside. We don't like to admit it, but watching a Karen lose control does something to us, not just emotionally, but psychologically. Their rage isn't just noise in a supermarket or a parking lot. It is a reflection of human behavior pushed to an extreme. And when we look closely, It reveals patterns we've all carried at different points in our lives. Moments when fear disguised itself as certainty, when insecurity became accusation, when our need to be right overtook our need to be kind. It's unsettling because it feels familiar, not identical, but adjacent. The deeper cost lies in what these moments trigger inside us. When we witness someone weaponize entitlement, it forces us to confront our own history with power. Times we felt unheard, times we felt small, times when the world didn't bend for us either. But instead of exploding outward, many of us imploded inward. We learnt to shrink, to accommodate, to smooth the edges of conflict so we wouldn't be punished for taking up space. That's why a Karen outburst can feel both infuriating and strangely magnetic. On some level, we're watching the opposite of what we were taught to be. But power expressed without introspection always extracts a price, not just for the person on the receiving end, but for the Karen themselves. Research on narcissistic injury from the University of Michigan shows that when a person's identity depends on external validation, any perceived threat to that identity activates the brain's threat response, releasing cortisol and reducing emotional regulation. In simpler terms, the more fragile the ego, the louder the reaction. What looks like confidence is actually a nervous system in crisis. And yet every meltdown leaves a ripple. The server who goes home shaken, the bystanders who absorb the tension, the community that becomes more guarded, more suspicious, more divided. Karen behavior doesn't just harm individuals, it erodes the psychological safety of a shared space. We start scanning rooms for danger the same way children do in unpredictable households. We tense before conflict. We rehearse conversations in our heads, their chaos becomes our caution. There's also a cultural cost. Every Karen incident reinforces old hierarchies. Who gets believed, who gets punished, who gets protected. It reminds us that privilege still shapes danger, that some people can weaponize their discomfort while others can't even express it without risk. It's a harsh mirror, but a necessary one. Because healing isn't just personal, it's collective. We cannot mend what we refuse to name. And somewhere beneath the public meltdowns, there is a quieter tragedy, a life lived in constant defense. A self built on brittle rules, a worldview so fragile it cracks under the slightest challenge. This isn't an excuse, it's an X-ray. When we see the wound, we understand the behavior, but we don't have to absorb it. Understanding is not enabling. It's simply clarity. So the real question is not why are they like this? It's what does their behavior awaken in us? The frustration, the fear, the urge to shrink, the desire to run, or maybe the courage to finally stand without trembling. Karens expose the systems around us, but also the stories within us. And when we understand both, we start reclaiming something Karen behavior tries to take away: our sense of internal steadiness, our boundary with dignity, and our right to exist without apology. There's a moment, after the shouting stops and the phone cameras lower, when the air feels strangely hollow. A Karen outburst doesn't just disrupt a room, it punctures the emotional field we all share. But if we look closely, there is something else left behind in the silence. An invitation. Not to excuse the behavior, not to justify the harm, but to understand what fear looks like when it has nowhere safe to go. And maybe, in that understanding, we can find a different way forward for them and for us. Because the truth is, healing doesn't begin with changing the person who erupts. It begins with noticing what their eruption awakens in our own bodies. The tight shoulders, the held breath, the familiar tension that whispers, "Stay small, stay quiet, stay safe." Many of us learnt those reactions long before adulthood. We became experts at calming storms that weren't ours, at shrinking to avoid punishment, at reading danger in the tone of a stranger's voice. Karen behavior brings that memory back, not to re-traumatize us, but to reveal where our own wounds still live. Healing in this context doesn't mean comforting harmful behavior. It means reclaiming our own sense of internal safety in the presence of someone else's instability. It means remembering that their loss of control does not have to pull us into the same spiral. We don't need to fix them, we don't need to match their volume, and we don't need to absorb their anger into our nervous system. Sometimes healing is simply the choice to stay rooted in ourselves while another person falls apart. And what about them, the ones we call Karens? While change is not guaranteed, the doorway to transformation is the same for anyone: awareness. But awareness rarely comes in the heat of conflict. It arrives later, often quietly, when the adrenaline fades and the replay begins. Some will defend their behavior forever. Others, just a few, will feel the sting of their own reflection and realize that their rage was never about the moment, but about the fear beneath it. Healing begins there, not in punishment, but in accountability. For the rest of us, healing also means drawing boundaries that honor our dignity. Calm, firm, steady boundaries that say, I see your pain, but I won't let it become my responsibility. Boundaries don't push people away. They protect the space where healthier connection can grow. They remind us that compassion doesn't require self-abandonment, and courage doesn't require confrontation. It simply asks us not to disappear when we most want to. If the Karen archetype shows us anything, it's how easily a person can lose themselves when identity is built on control instead of connection. And it reminds us to choose differently, not because we're better, but because we know what it feels like to live in fear, and we're tired of carrying it forward. Healing, in the end, is not about fixing them. It's about breaking the cycle. The real lesson isn't about Karens at all. It's about us learning how to stand in a world where conflict exists without letting it reshape who we are. Because when we find steadiness inside ourselves, the outbursts of others no longer have the power to shake us. And in that small, quiet victory, healing begins. In the end, understanding the psychology behind a Karen isn't about pointing fingers. It's about choosing who we want to be when the world gets loud. If this reflection helps you see a piece of yourself, or even the people around you, with a little more clarity and compassion, stay with me. There are so many more stories to untangle, more truths to soften into. If you're ready for that journey, consider subscribing. Our quiet work continues together.